move.
And you're going 80.
Yeah, I had to slow down to 79. It was very upsetting. Very upsetting. So I was white knuckling it for a little bit, but it's all good.
Hi, welcome to Community Roots, a place where we gather in community to talk about mental health so we can travel the journey of life together. I'm Julie Richards.
I'm Adrianne Johnson.
And we're off the beaten path today with Jason Wellman. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks. Good to be here.
We're glad to have you. We just are curious to have you share your story with us today about what mental health has meant to you, why it matters. We just want to get to know you a little bit today.
Yeah, sure. So I'd say mental health, the awareness that it was important, really came into my life when I would have been newly married, within the first year of my marriage, fresh out of college, had just graduated college, and decided to go to seminary. And that's really when I kind of experienced some past issues that I had thought kind of were taken care of, or I just kind of moved past, and it kind of came crashing down in a dream that woke me up from my sleep. So part of my story is that, I grew up in a very conservative, I would today call it a fundamentalist faith background. It's very conservative. So there was no talk of mental health. Everything was very spiritualized, and so in the midst of that, when I was 11 years old, I started to became a victim of sexual abuse. And so for 2 years of my life, had my world just kind of blown up. And in the midst of that, my family life was crumbling as well. My parents were experiencing some major difficulties in their marriage. And so after the abuse ended, I was left with this void of nobody to talk to, nobody to process with. And so I kind of internalized everything. And when I look back at my early teenage years and later teenage years, I was a functioning teen. Like it didn't propel me into abusive behavior. It didn't propel me into drugs or anything that you may hear from other people who have been abused. But what it did is it propelled me into working really hard and trying really hard to appear successful, but internally feeling like I was a wreck and a shell of a person. So fast forward to seminary. In my first year of seminary, we were put in small groups, cohorts. And so I'm building relationships with my cohort leader in the team. And one night I had a dream, and it was a nightmare type thing. And I don't dream often, and so when I do dream, it's kind of startling. And in this dream, I was at a family reunion. So my abuser was a family member. And my family member was sitting across a picnic table from me, and he had my driver's license. And I was arguing with him about getting my driver's license back. And we're just having this fight over my driver's license. And I remember waking up and kind of sweating and breathing heavily, and I was married, and so I turned to my wife and I woke her up and I said, "Sarah, I need to tell you about this dream. It's really unsettling." And she knew about the abuse, she knew about my story. So I tell her this dream, and she says, she's very wise, and she says, "I think part of your identity was taken from you, and you've really never processed that." And so she said, I really think that you should tell your cohort." And so that next morning, I went to seminary, and I told my cohort, I said, "Hey, I need to tell you about not only this dream, but about what's led up to this dream in my story." So I shared that with my cohort, and it was a very, very sacred place to be able to do that. And my cohort leader pulled me aside afterwards, and he said, "Hey, I want you to know that at the seminary, students get free counseling." And he said, the school I went to had a large counseling program, and said, "I really think this is an opportunity for you to start processing some of the pain that you've experienced." And so I signed up to go to counseling, and for the first time that I started to receive tools to be able to talk about what had happened, something I had suppressed and something that I thought, I look relatively normal. I did well in college. I worked hard and always had a job. And so externally, I thought I was doing really well. But my therapist helped me really start getting at more of an integrated self, so that my outside life really matched what was going on inside. So that was really the first time that I began to wrestle and experience a healthy environment where I could process some of those things.
I'm curious, when you were raised in that kind of fundamentalist, it sounds like your family life wasn't really a safe place that you could process what happened.
Yeah.
How did you hold that together? How did you compartmentalize it, or something that allowed you to keep going in that point where you turned more towards perfectionism?
Yeah. In the environment in which I was raised, in the kind of theological tradition, it is not a safe place to talk about those type of things. And I had known other people in my life that had been abused, and came forward to talk to the pastor or some, staff member at the church, and were pretty pushed aside and almost made to feel like it was their fault. And so I knew that the tradition I was in was not a safe place to process it. But then I also knew my family life wasn't functional enough or healthy enough to process it. So I thought, this is something I'm just going to have to bear on my own. And I remember having at 13, having a dialogue with myself saying, well, I can either let this break me or I can just move on. And I chose the path of moving on, thinking that was the best route. And what did help me in the midst of that is I had some phenomenal teachers at school.
Wow.
So I would find, because my home life wasn't great, struggling as, everything I was dealing with, I would find every activity to participate in at school so I could stay later. So it was, until I had a job, and I started working under the table at 13, I did anything I could to just not go home and not have to sit and think about some of the things that happened. But I had these teachers who would find me projects to do at school. I'd stick around their classroom and they'd say, hey, will you help me file this paperwork? And I knew, now looking back, I know they were just keeping me busy,
But it was your safe place.
It was very safe.
Yeah,
very safe.
Sure.
And I think of two teachers, my band director and choir director. Had I not had them in my life, I don't know if I could have made it through school. I mean, they just really were a safe place for me. And I don't know if they knew anything was going on, but they must have been aware enough that they knew I needed a safe place to be.
How powerful that is for teachers, band directors,
Yes.
people that are on the front lines.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I think beyond what they're teaching in the classroom, they're such a strong presence, an influential presence in a young person's life, and I'm indebted to them, for sure.
That is so cool. And then it's so neat, too, that as you opened up to your cohort and your professor that was able to say, hey, there's an opportunity here for you to walk more healing, and that you had the courage to be able to face it.
Yeah, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful for my wife who kind of called this out, and she gave me language. The whole identity bit. I just never thought about that. I never thought, oh, that's right. A part of me was taken away, and I think my kind of inner world was crying out to get that back and to reclaim my own identity.
You're in a place we could deal with the trauma.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think she gave me permission. She encouraged me in the process. And it was just like all these perfect things were in place. I had a wife who gave me language and encouragement. I had this cohort leader who told me about the counseling. I was going to a school in which it was free because I'm a cheap, and so I probably wouldn't have gone initially as a poor seminary student. But it was free, and so I really had no excuse. And so everything kind of lined up for me.
I'm always impressed by how it's not always the trauma that we go through, but it's how people around us respond to it, and if we have support or not. And what a contrast for you that growing up, you didn't really have that safe place at home, and you found it by going to teachers and activities and things that could feel safe for you. And then later, what a changing turning point for you that you were able to have your wife and people who were safe for you, and then to start into counseling.
Yeah, and I think, obviously abuse of any kind is traumatic, and sexual abuse is really traumatic. For men, it is very hard to feel like you have a safe place to talk about it. There's such a stigma associated with that, and masculinity, and I think, the timing was right in my life as I was an adult now that I could just own up and say, okay, I need to talk about this. This can't plague me any longer. But I have such a heart for men who have experienced similar things, because they may not have the social circle, the social environment in which they can feel free enough to talk. It's such a stigmatized topic for men that, I look out, a pastor, so I look out at my congregation and just think of the statistics, and knowing that there are men in my sanctuary that have experienced the same thing, and it breaks my heart. And so, I think in general, the more people can have a healthy social environment that's encouraging them to go seek help, the better.
Absolutely. That's powerful. So you're in a position now that you have quite a lot of influence,
Yeah.
that you've got people that are listening to you each week and exposed to your path of mental health. How have you continued to grow into that place of mental health, not only through the healing of your story, but also in how you maintain that in your day-to-day life?
Yeah. For somebody who, I do have influence. And so the struggle I've always had is, what is my story for myself and what is meant to be shared? And early on in my healing, it was very much just for me. Like, I needed that space just to do my own healing and processing. And it's only been within the last 2 years that I finally got to the place where I'm starting to feel like, because I've come so far in my own healing, now I'm able to start sharing it, and it can become somebody else's part of their story, that they've heard somebody or they know somebody who's experienced it. So about a year ago, in a sermon, I shared this in front of my congregation. And, it was a nervous wreck leading up to it, because whenever you share your story, you can't control it. You can't hold on to it anymore. And so it's a very vulnerable feeling to stand up in front of people and tell your story.
Was it cathartic?
Yeah, it was. I think it was cathartic in some ways. I think it was freeing. It just felt like, okay, this is, and honestly, it felt more like a celebration, if I could say a word to associate with it, because it felt like, man, I've come really far,
Yes.
and now I'm comfortable enough to start sharing this. And what the beauty that came out of it is, at the end of one of the services, I'm greeting people as they're leaving the service, and several men kind of pulled me in and said, I'm one of those too.
Wow.
And it's just for them to feel safe to be able to acknowledge this is a part of their story. Yeah. So I've been able to follow up a little bit with them and encourage them and try to find some counselors. And some of them, one gentleman had gone through counseling and has done really well. Another one is just getting to the point where he told me that he was one of those individuals. Experience was a huge breakthrough in his life. And so that makes you, like, it's the beauty that comes out of the ashes.
It's humbling.
It is that my story and the muck and the mire that I went through can become something freeing for somebody else. Or even, again, for men, to give them permission to bare their soul a little bit and say, this is me too. I've experienced the same thing. So it's been humbling, for sure.
You are that safe figure.
Yeah. And I feel privileged. It's a privilege to be able to connect with other men in that capacity and to know a little bit of their story and to share that with them. So
how do you cope with vulnerability when you're speaking about your own story?
So vulnerability is not my strength. And so I decided this last year, really what gave me strength was I went back into therapy. So I had processed a lot of the healing of the abuse, but then I could tell in my life that I was holding people at a distance and couldn't figure it out. I was doing my doctoral work at the same time. And so again, people in my life encouraging me. I had a mentor in that process say, hey, as I was starting to verbalize some things, said, I think you may want to talk to somebody a little bit more about this and go a little bit deeper. So I entered back into therapy. And the therapy wasn't about the abuse, because I had done so much processing and healing around that. It was, why am I so afraid to let people in? And so that, having a pretty intensive year of therapy this last year really started to give me permission to open up the door a little bit. And just sitting with my therapist, he encouraged me, you might be at the point where this is your next step, is to share your story. And so I did a lot of talking to my wife and family, because, she's brought into the story, and I have 4 kids. And so trying to think through that. So I had to do some talking with them, my children, beforehand, saying, hey, Dad's going to get up and share a little bit of his story, and try to tell them in an appropriate way what had happened. And then just having that encouragement, knowing I had a therapist who was supporting me. So I shared my story, and then on a Sunday, and I had a therapy session on Monday morning. And so that was good.
Had that backup scheduled, support right ready.
To sit and to process it a little bit more. And so now I'm at the place in my life where vulnerability, while it doesn't necessarily feel natural to me, I'm getting increasingly comfortable with being vulnerable. So even like sharing this story with you all is a very vulnerable thing to do. But I know that it's important to my own healing, and hopefully it's important to somebody else who might listen and say, that's me too. I've experienced that too.
I really appreciate that you did own your story for yourself first, and that you took that time to heal and to say, this is sacred space that I don't need to put myself right out there right away.
Yeah.
And that you took that time, but then also realize that there's a point where more people need helped, that need reached, that if I don't risk stepping out on some level that does feel vulnerable, but it can also be wisely, with discernment, with safety around you, having an idea of how much to share, when, or with whom, that allows other people to embrace their own healing. Yeah. That's powerful.
Yeah. And I think, so the thing I had always watched, I watch a lot of other pastors. I watch their sermons, and you can tell whether it's a pastor or a teacher or somebody with influence who has done healthy processing and who hasn't. and so I wanted to make sure that I had really come to terms with my story and owned it and done the work before I would turn and tell somebody else, because I wanted to make sure that my story didn't become damaging to somebody else. I wanted to make sure that I had all the appropriate filters in place to share what is appropriate and what's not. I knew I needed to do a lot of that work so that my story could be told and received in a healthy way. I've seen people get up and it becomes traumatic to everybody else sitting there listening to their story, because they've not done the deeper inner work in themselves. And so I knew I need to do this first before I would ever really get up and share it in a larger capacity.
How do you know if someone is a safe person to tell, and how would you encourage us to be more safe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say part of it is intuitive. Part of it is just how you naturally feel around that person. I would say it has to be somebody who just naturally starts creating space without probing too deep. Like they're not wanting to know all your deepest, darkest secrets just so that they can know all your deepest, darkest secrets, Right. But they just kind of slowly ease into it, and you start feeling like this is somebody I can let a little bit of my guard down. So I know for myself, I early on in kind of my own healing, as I would share this with people, I may share just a portion of it, and then I would kind of assess their reaction. Were they like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened, tell me more? Or were they somebody who would just say, I'm really sorry that happened, and was an empathetic person? And that's where that intuitiveness, I think our inner world responds naturally to empathy. And so when you are receiving empathy from somebody, you just feel like, oh, I can lay a little bit more of my guard down. So and for somebody who it doesn't vulnerability is not natural or doesn't feel natural, it takes me some time. And so I'll share a little piece of the story with somebody and just kind of assess how are they holding this space with me? How are they reacting?
Okay, let's just pause for a moment because I want to gather thoughts. And
Same.
where
I am so humbled to be in your presence and walk this journey with you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And part of my inability to quickly react is just sitting with you.
Just sitting in the story and being here is powerful.
It's
it's like I don't want to just push through that and race ahead. Like I'm trying to
I just want to sit in your space.
Honor the space.
Honor it.
Mm-hmm. Because it's not just a let's go after this and attack it and ask things. It's like...
I did want to ask more about how your journey happened. Like, how did you walk the walk all the way to where you are now? What was the healing journey like for you, and what did you do? And that EMDR piece is really important, I think.
Okay.
But I also don't... I mean, you two have a more developed relationship. I don't want to just poke where I shouldn't poke because I don't know your vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
I don't be like, so
well,
tell
and
me
that's some of my question too. Is like
poke away,
which I kind of said before, but like, how does this get lived out? I think let's go there.
Ooh, I love that. Ooh.
And one of my curiosities too is, as a leader, not just as a person of influence through a congregation, but a staff that you lead and that you prioritize mental health, how do you notice where there are areas that need worked on for your staff? And how do you help address those directly?
Yeah.
Based on your healing journey?
Yeah.
So that you can kind of influence in that way towards other people. We've talked on Community Roots about systemic change, that how do we change the world? And we do that through our own individual healing. And then we also do that through who we influence in our family and in our workplace through our healing and growth. So how have you done that in your workplace and with your staff?
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of that comes back to understanding my role as a senior leader. I do have a lot of influence, and I can set the tone of a lot of our a lot of our staff meetings. And so I've been intentional with my staff of moving away from a business oriented staff meeting to more of what in our Christian theological language is a more spiritual formation oriented gathering. So we get to the business of like, what things happening on the calendar and what are the logistics, what tables need set up in this room. We get to that, but we first always spend time. The question I ask my staff, I just had this last week, is we went around the room and I said, how is your soul? Which is a counseling oriented question, a mental health question, but in a theological language. So how's your soul? How's your inner life doing right now? And we made space for our staff just to share. Here's what's going on. I'm struggling with this. I'm physically exhausted, and I can feel it. I'm short with my family, and it's because I'm exhausted. And so we go around and we make space for each other, and we give each other permission to bear a little bit more of ourselves. So what that has done over the course of really the last year and a half of kind of redoing the way we do staff meetings is it's created permission for our staff to wrestle with some hard things. And so out of that I've had one-on-one conversations with staff in which I've said, hey, you shared this in staff, and I'm really appreciative that you did this. I'm seeing some signs that are concerning me, and I would like you to if it fits, if it works, I want to give you some references for some therapists. And so I've referred people to I love to say my therapist, Jeff. I've referred people to him and helped our staff find some other resources. I'm really big on taking a day off. And I always, if a staff member comes to me and they say, I'm exhausted, I'm just frustrated, they're allowed to leave. If they need a day off, that's even if it's an additional day off, they're allowed to take that. They just say, I need a mental health day. And there's no questions asked. I don't, it's not like I'm checking it to see, oh, that person's, are they really, taking it? If they think they need it, then I give them permission to do that. So I think what that's done over time is it's just creating an environment in which we recognize mental health is something we're all on a journey on. There's no stigma or shame associated with it. It's just who we are. And I think in our line of work, it's so important because we as people in ministry, we deal with the trauma of other people. Sometimes that's in a healthy way where they come to us and they say, I need some help processing this. Sometimes it's unprocessed trauma and we become the target. And so that can become heavy and hard. And so I want to help our staff. I've tried to help our staff create a place where we can talk about that and begin to process that together.
I love how that values people and honors their journey and story as well, that we are limited in our humanity. We don't have a way to just push through everything and pretend that it doesn't exist. It's so much more powerful to be able to embrace reality and what we need, and that it's okay to have needs. Yeah. I'm curious about some of the red flags that you notice whenever you tell someone, hey, I'm noticing this happening. This might be a sign that counseling would be helpful for you. What are some of those things that you're noticing?
Yeah, I think, a big thing I notice is when there's a strong reaction to something that maybe is the thing we're talking about is very trivial. So, I may come into a staff person's office and may need to say, hey, we need to think of this ministry a little differently, or we need to tweak some things. And if I get a big reaction, whether that's anger or, they start crying, or some staff, you can just see their body, they shut down. They just, like a wall goes up, they block it. Those are red flags that something's going on inside of them that they're not processing. It could be that they're just tired, or it could be something a little bit bigger. And so those become, I'll have follow-up conversations. We'll get through the thing that needs to get through, but often then I'll come back in, especially if it's in a group setting, I may come back in at a later time and have a one-on-one and say, hey, what's really going on? You reacted far bigger than what the topic required a reaction from. Others are if I see the staff working long hours. It could be that they're dealing with a project that's just taking a lot of their time. It could be that they're avoiding something. And so I'll just ask. I think they're pretty accustomed to me kind of probing a little bit. I'll just ask, how are things at home? How are you doing? What do you still love your job? Because it can be easy to hate our jobs. And so it's very common for me to just ask some of those probing questions. I look at their timesheets and I make sure they're taking a day off. And if they're not taking a day off, I'll come back to them and I'll say, hey, I've noticed you've worked 3 weeks and I haven't seen that you've really taken a day off. What's going on? We need to make sure you have a day off. And then I have to model that as well in my own life to make sure, I'm really taking my day off as well.
I was curious how you keep yourself balanced if there's so much trauma with the people that you work with, not just on the staff, but with the various family members and people in your congregation, that they have so much going on in their life and they are throwing a lot of that around unprocessed. Mm-hmm. How do you keep yourself in balance in addition to your day off?
Yeah, so I meet with, it's online, 3 other guys that I love and trust. One is from California, one's from St. Louis, and one is from Washington. And we get together once a month online. And it's a Zoom conversation, so we're seeing each other face to face. And we process things. We process what's going on in our family life that we need some help with. What's going on in our ministerial life. What are we feeling, sensing going on inside? Just anything. I mean, it becomes such a sacred and safe place to talk about. We then get together for a week-long retreat, the 4 of us together. And so we spend a week together where we process that. So a lot of the things I may deal with at the church or in family life or just life in general, they're a place that I know I can go to and share that with. So they've in many ways become my accountability partner. So like going through therapy, a lot of my conversations with them were what I was talking about with my therapist. And they're my biggest cheerleaders. They're the guys that hold me up. And again, kind of going back to men's mental health, I think it's so important that men have other men in their life that they can have that safety with. It's become so vital to my own well-being.
Well, we're going to wrap things up today. Thank you so much, Jason, for all that you've shared with us. Such great lessons that you've learned along the way of your healing journey. Is there anything as a closing thought that you still have that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I would say it doesn't matter what your job is. It doesn't matter if you're sitting behind a cubicle or standing in front of a classroom, or in my case, standing up in front of a church, a congregation. All of us need safe places where we can process a lot of the deeper things, whether that's trauma or just the stress of our life. And so I hope that as a ministry leader, I can have influence to give permission to my congregation to say mental health is not a scary thing, to remove the stigma associated with it. It's a gift. And the fact that there are gifted people that can help us do that, we all should take advantage of that. So, anybody who listens that has influence, I think the more you can create that space and permission and encourage the people that you lead in whatever capacity is a huge support for that person.
I would like to thank you for being here with us. I have been silent in my humility and in my honored space to be with you. It's been phenomenal and breathtaking to listen to your story, to allow me to be with you as you share it. You share your vulnerabilities and your strengths and your powerful message of destigmatization and sharing and the importance of community. It's very empowering to me. So I want to say thank you from the deepest place in my heart.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
We're so thankful you could be with us today.
Thank you. It was fun.
Well, that wraps up our episode for today. If you have any thoughts or feedback, ideas, anything that you would like to communicate with us, we want to hear from you. We want you to feel part of this community, that you can email us at communityroots.pod@gmail.com. We also keep our important updates that we post on Facebook. You can look for us under Community Roots. And we would love if you would rate us and review on iTunes. We've got a handful of rates on there and would love to be able to read some of your reviews on the air so that we can, again, build that sense of relationship and community that you are a part of. We want to do a shout out of thanks to Samuel Richards, our manager, to Lisa Gilchrist and Adrianne Johnson.
And to you.
And
to Julie.
And to just our listeners especially that are encouraged by learning about mental health and having conversations with people that are important in your life. Share our podcast with them so that more people can be encouraged on this journey into mental health. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Awesome. Oh my gosh, you are so good.
You did awesome.
Oh my gosh.